Hello everyone, and welcome to our 2024 Halloween special. Today we're diving into the weird, scary, and historically significant events that have occurred on Halloween. From mysterious bodies found on islands to battleships sinking in significant skirmishes, this holiday, famous for trick-or-treating and the thin veil between the living and the dead, has also seen its fair share of real horror. Before we start, I want to warn viewers that some of you might find the content in this video unsettling. And while these stories are accounts of historical or contemporary events, they are also sometimes very macabre. Viewer discretion is advised. Additionally, I want to thank my channel members. I'll be listing their names in the outro to show my appreciation for them. If you enjoy this video, by the way, I invite you to like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments if I missed any wild Halloween events. Thank you for watching, and with that, let's get into these weird Halloween happenings. On October 29th of 2012, a man and his daughter were kayaking, probably having a nice bonding experience as they kayaked on the Eel River in California, in the northern portion of the state. They had just kayaked to a mushrooming spot of theirs, probably a wonderful hobby for spending time together, and his daughter was playing around, and the man in this situation noticed something. Now, he'd been here before and he'd seen this thing before, but he hadn't really paid any mind before. What he was used to seeing was the tip of a sneaker or something sticking out of the ground. Folks toss out junk, and as we know, this junk often ends up buried here and there, and we don't like it, but usually this littering is not nefarious, or at least not a serious crime. But see, this time he saw the presence of something else. Another sneaker started to stick out from under the soil, and the two were both lined up eerily well. Now the man did what you gotta do here. He got a stick and he started poking and prodding at the dirt, and he quickly noticed that he was not just digging up a shoe, but also a sock, and then something that looked like a bone sticking inside of one of the sneakers. Now, I should note, according to the wife of the man, with the family remaining anonymous, she explained that her husband simply thought the skeleton was just a pair of roots running into the shoes, but he freaked the flip out when he noticed these were bones and he'd simply unearthed a skeleton. He actually made the interesting choice to put some of these bones in a plastic bag he had with them, and even came back with his wife and a shovel to dig up more, only to discover a whole leg bone. Now, I don't know why they needed to do more digging at this point, but yep, they found the leg, and then they called police. But they only called the police after waiting a whole dang night, calling them the next day instead. Goodness gracious, folks, PSA, if you find a body, just call the police immediately. Anyways, the police obviously were called, and they showed up at first thinking this was a joke for Halloween, but quickly they found the bones and believed the story. The body was removed at this point, and the body and the items with it were cataloged. The body had a shirt that said, "Before I started working here, I drank, smoked, and used foul language, for no reason at all. Thanks to this job, I now have a reason." The pants the body wore appeared to be jeans of some variety, and they were also wearing shoes, of course, that's what got them found, and they had a pocket knife on them too. Following this, in March of 2013, the Mendocino Sheriff's Office put out a press release about the findings, finding that the victim was a white, adult male, about 5'11 to 6'5", and that he was 25 to 45 years of age. According to the reports I'm seeing, the only other details are that the location is only accessible by boat. And from what I can tell, this case went cold with no more news on it. That is, until October of 2020, when nearby, only about 5 miles away, a forester inspecting the local timber harvest found something of interest, a human skull, lying under the ground, strangely close to the location of the skeleton in sneakers. So this story is pretty dark, I should warn you, but folks that pass away on Halloween apparently have a knack for ending up being mistaken for Halloween decorations. There's two stories like this I have for you today. First, there was an event in Frederica, Delaware in 2005, when in late October, residents noticed a macabre Halloween decoration on a Wednesday night along a busy road. Of course, macabre decorations are a Halloween theme, so folks just assumed that is exactly what it was and let it go for hours, allowing the decoration to sway away in the wind back and forth. This decoration was suspended 15 feet above the ground in a tree and seemed to fit in well enough. But after a few hours, folks got suspicious of it and called the police. It wasn't a decoration. It ended up being one local 42-year-old woman who had decided to take her own life, and it led to this event. Another incident here was in Chillicothe, Ohio, and here residents thought there was a Halloween decoration or maybe a prank hanging from a fence. But they quickly realized it was actually a woman. This woman turned out to be Rebecca Cade, a 31-year-old local who was recently attacked and during this event sustained head and neck trauma. She was propped up on this fence in Chillicothe afterwards. I should note, in this case, the suspect was apprehended, and the cause for this was that the suspect got into a fight with the individual that was propped up on the fence. On Halloween night of 1963 at the Indiana State Fairgrounds Coliseum, 4,000 people were in attendance watching a performance of Holiday on Ice, which was scheduled to start at 8:30 but started closer to 8:45 that evening. By all accounts, the performance was pleasant, and nothing unusual went on with it. That is until around 11:06 p.m. when right before the show's finale was about to begin, there was a rumbling on the southeastern end of the area. This rumbling was accompanied by individuals flying through the air towards the ice rink, and a load-bearing wall collapsing shortly after. This rumbling was actually an explosion from a liquefied petroleum tank, which was leaking in a supply room underneath the stands and contacted a heating element near the concessions, causing it to ignite and subsequently explode. Now, after this first explosion, it's noted that the Holiday on Ice Orchestra actually continued to play for whatever reason, which perhaps contributed to the orderly evacuation which occurred and prevented anyone from getting harmed in a stampede trying to leave the arena. The first explosion was followed by a second one, and this one was documented to have caused a 40-foot-high fireball, which was caused by the first explosion's heat actually igniting another nearby liquefied petroleum tank adjacent to the first. Luckily for the guests, one of the attendees at the performance was an off-duty firefighter who was able to directly call the Indianapolis Fire Department to describe the scene, and within 9 minutes of the first explosion, emergency personnel began to arrive. Oddly, the exact same arrival time is reported to have been achieved by the local news photographers. Now, of course, it was quickly determined that heavy equipment would be needed, such as cranes and tow trucks, to free some trapped individuals in the rubble. This equipment was ordered, and from what I can tell, it actually did save a few people that were trapped under the rubble. Ultimately, 81 individuals passed away during this accident, and 400 people were injured. Following the event, many were indicted, but eventually everyone involved had charges dropped or overturned, and the victims of the disaster were awarded $4.6 million in settlements. By December 12th, the Coliseum actually reopened to host a cattle show, and it almost seemed like business went on as usual without anyone in particular being held accountable. This event was the largest single disaster in Indiana's history. In 1982, on Halloween night, 18-year-old James Adamski, a student at Depew High School, attended a party in Cheektowaga, New York, at the 5 and 23 bar on Transit Road and Elliott Avenue in Depew. According to reports, he left home that night in good spirits, giving his little brother a kiss on the forehead and telling him to have a good night trick-or-treating before heading to a party. Back in 1982, drinking at the age of 18 was legal, and from the sounds of it, James was taking full advantage of this, partying like there was no tomorrow while dressed as Alice Cooper. He apparently was partying a little too hard, as accounts report that he actually got into an altercation with some other partygoers. Nothing physical, but some people got sick of him at the party, and he was described as drinking heavily during this event. At about 3:30 a.m., James was reported to leave the party and was described as stumbling out of it with a woman, one of his friends, and slowly walking up Transit Road. The following morning, when his parents checked his bedroom, they found that he had never made it home. Following this, a search was launched that lasted weeks, culminating in December of that year, when the day after Christmas, a couple of rabbit hunters, while checking their traps, found a shallow grave in some secluded woodland about 4 miles from the 5 and 23 bar where James was last seen. They dug at this grave alongside some railroad tracks that was covered in twigs and leaves, and they found James' body, still in his Halloween costume. It was found that James was beaten. By what isn't entirely clear, sources say probably a baseball bat or a tire iron or some other blunt object. But whatever it was, blunt force trauma was the cause of his demise. As for who committed the act, it also remains unclear. James was, by all accounts, a well-liked individual at his school. Additionally, the individuals he got into an altercation with were interviewed and found not to be culprits by the local police. Beyond this, hundreds of other individuals were interviewed, all of which had solid alibis or did not seem otherwise suspicious, leading police to drop them all as suspects. The police's strongest theory was that James tried to hitchhike home and ended up with the wrong driver. In March of 2017, the case was reopened, despite being 35 years old, and $11,000 was offered for information leading to the arrest and indictment of the individual responsible. As of today, nothing has changed. On Halloween of 1837, 3 steamboats, the Yazoo, the John Norton, and the Monmouth, were transporting the Upper Creeks band of Muskogee natives from their homes in the southeastern United States to the Great Plains region, specifically in present-day Oklahoma. These boats had just left the New Orleans region and were just north of Baton Rouge, near a place called Prophet Island. This evening, conditions were cold and rainy, in addition to this transport occurring in the middle of the night, and the Monmouth was overcrowded and full of natives with some 700 individuals aboard. Traveling the opposite direction, there was a boat named the Warren, which was towing another boat named the Trenton. At some point, the negligent crew of the Monmouth was not paying enough attention, and either due to an error in piloting or due to strong currents in the Mississippi River, the Monmouth veered into the path of the Warren, which itself was able to avoid the ship, but its cargo, the Trenton, was not, colliding with the Monmouth with an initial impact that actually threw hundreds of individuals into the river below, splitting the boat into multiple pieces, with the hull of the boat sinking and the cabin floating downstream in 2 parts. As a result, 311 natives drowned in this incident, with many more being badly injured. Survivors were picked up by the Yazoo, John Newton, and Warren, and those that perished were thrown into mass graves near Port Allen, a nearby Louisiana city. This event was the worst transportation disaster on the Mississippi before the Civil War, and the body count for this event is considered part of that of the Trail of Tears. In the aftermath of the event, many things that contributed to the accident were considered, and it even acted as motivation for changes in the maritime safety along rivers in the then western portions of the United States. For instance, at the time, warning lights weren't customarily used aboard boats in the Mississippi, and this event led to regulations regarding the display of lights, as well as bells, whistles, and signals on steamboats. It also motivated the late 19th century deployment of markers, buoys, and signal lights on the rivers of the American West. Cindy Song was an individual who had recently moved from her home in Korea to Virginia to live with her aunt and uncle in 1995. She made this move for better educational opportunities, and it seemed she achieved this desire, as at the time this story takes place, Cindy was an art student at Penn State University. Cindy was generally considered an individual of high standing by her peers. She was responsible, achieved good grades throughout her education, and held down multiple jobs, at which she was known to be diligent. On Halloween night of 2001, Cindy was 21 years old, and she and a few friends went to a nightclub named Players Nightclub, a venue that today is known as Basement Night Spot, to drink and dance the night away. This evening, Cindy was dressed as a rabbit for Halloween. I should note this was not a suggestive costume, but was rather a cute variety of rabbit. This evening, the 3 friends partied at the club until about 2 a.m. in the morning, when the club closed, and afterwards they went to a friend's house for a few hours to play some video games together. The night concluded for Cindy at about 4 a.m. when she was dropped off at her apartment and watched by her friends walking towards her apartment's door. The next morning, Cindy's roommate actually returned home from a long trip in Philadelphia, and she made plans with Cindy to catch up. This was before they both went out together with friends. When she got home, upon entering the apartment, nothing seemed particularly off, so to speak. The apartment door was locked from the outside. Cindy's fake eyelashes she'd been wearing on Halloween were in the apartment, as was her backpack that she had with her the night before. And this backpack had her cell phone inside of it, something that she was noted to never go anywhere without. All of this indicated that she had come inside the night before. Additionally, there was no sign of a struggle, and the only thing out of place was that Cindy herself was nowhere to be found, and nor was her bunny costume, indicating she never actually took it off. Everything at this point seemed weird, but nothing was necessarily wrong. But the first red flag appeared when Cindy missed a shift at her job, and by November 4th, 2001, 3 days after she was last seen, she was reported missing. The speculation by Cindy's peers was that she may have entered her apartment, but decided to go to a nearby 24-hour market late at night that she was known to frequent, and that if she did do this, she probably left in a rabbit costume. And also, she probably had her money and driver's license with her. After Halloween night, there was no credit card activity, there were no emails sent, or there were no calls to or from her phone to indicate her whereabouts. As low-hanging fruit, the nearby woods were actually searched, but nothing was found there either. But all of this doesn't mean that peculiar happenings and stories didn't leave a few breadcrumbs for authorities to follow towards a probable outcome. For instance, 200 miles from Penn State, in Philadelphia's Chinatown, there were actually reports of a woman matching Cindy's description being forced into a vehicle by a man as she yelled for help. Bystanders tried to intervene, but were threatened by the man, who was said to have an olive to light brown complexion and medium hair length. I should note, authorities considered this account kind of dubious as the witness's story changed between interviews. Also, Cindy and her boyfriend had broken up a couple of months earlier, but police confirmed his alibi and ruled him out as a subject. Perhaps the most promising and also troubling lead in this case was in June 2003, when one criminal informant named Paul Weekly told police about two career criminals who had abducted a woman from the area around Penn State University. They thought this woman was a working woman when they saw her in 2001. This criminal said that the two kept the woman on a vault on their property, and this informant thought the woman matched Cindy's description. One of these men actually went missing, and police inquiry led them down a rabbit hole which led to the property of the other mentioned criminal, who had multiple bodies buried on his property, including the aforementioned one that went missing. Although it's worth noting, nothing of Cindy's was found buried here. This being said, I wouldn't consider this lead totally useless just yet, as the criminal in question, whose yard was dug up for bodies, didn't actually live at the address that was searched when Cindy went missing. Now, regardless of what happened, this whole saga remains unsolved. When you ask most individuals when the first American casualties of World War II occurred, they would probably say Pearl Harbor, but in reality there were a handful of maritime incidents involving the American fleet and the Axis powers prior to December of 1941. The incident in question here concerned the Reuben James, a 4-funnel Clemson-class destroyer constructed post-World War I, which spent time as part of the U.S. Atlantic Fleet and had toured the Mediterranean, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. In 1939, this ship returned to the Atlantic Fleet after navigating much of the world, and was tasked with escorting convoys bound for Great Britain, carrying war materials from our arsenal of democracy. Unfortunately for the James Reuben, German U-boats considered all ships in a convoy fair game, even if Germany wasn't at war with their home country. Early in the morning of October 31st, 1941, while escorting convoy HX-156 near Iceland, the Reuben James was torpedoed by German U-boat U-552. This occurred as it was positioned between an ammunition ship and the convoy, as it was in the process of dropping depth charges on another U-boat that was in the vicinity. The ship was hit forward by a torpedo meant for the merchant ship, and it blew off the ship's whole bow, sinking it immediately. The aft section only floated for 5 minutes before it went down. This event was the first loss of a U.S. Navy ship during the entirety of World War II, and it actually only received minimal media coverage, with the exception of a few mentions in the news and its mention in a few songs, including one by folk singer Woody Guthrie, who sang, "Tell me, what were their names? Tell me, what were their names? Did you have a friend on the good Reuben James?" Marilyn Damman was a stay-at-home mother of two. her 2.5-year-old son, Stephen, and a 7-month-old daughter, whose father was named Jerry and was an airman. The two lived in Long Island, New York, and on October 31st of 1955, Marilyn took her children for a walk to the local food fair market, which was about a block and a half from their home, entering it at 2:45 p.m. She quickly ran inside to grab bread and decided because it wouldn't be long she would leave her children together outside, telling them to be good as she walked in. I should quickly note, this practice was not taboo at the time, and it's worth mentioning that Marilyn's children were not even the only children left outside of this food market that afternoon. I'm not saying this was a smart decision, but it also wasn't an unusual one for the time. When she returned after about 10 minutes, both children were nowhere to be found. Now, Marilyn, after getting help, was actually taken to the hospital for shock, and a search party of about 2,000 volunteers, Boy Scouts, and civil servants was set in motion to search the area around the bakery, which included parks, golf courses, and waterways on Long Island. Relatively quickly, the 7-month-old daughter was found in her carriage a few blocks away. But regarding Stephen, the young boy, the search yielded no leads, and he was never seen again. Some media coverage of the event actually did yield ransom letters, responding to the request for the child's safe return, but it ended up that this character was just a local student trying to take advantage of the distraught family for money. Some also speculated at first that the boy in the box, another famous case, not quite a missing child but a found child that was found in a park in 1957 in Pennsylvania, may have actually been young Stephen, as the two boys both had blonde hair and blue eyes. But the boy in the box had an arm fracture, and his footprint shape didn't align with that of Stephen's. Later attempts at comparison using DNA confirmed the two children were not the same individual. There were also dubious reports of a woman and a boy that looked similar to Stephen hitchhiking near a tavern in Kansas. Another weird event occurred in 2009, when a man came forward to the police after reading this story, believing he might actually have been Stephen. His name was John Barnes, and apparently, growing up, he didn't feel like a proper member of his family. Sadly, although this was taken seriously by the FBI, DNA testing revealed that he was not in fact Stephen, and the man's father actually came forward claiming that John was just mad that he divorced John's mother. From what I can tell, this whole event devastated Stephen's family, leading his parents to divorce and move back to the Midwest. On Halloween morning of 1979, in Georgetown, Texas, a woman was found in a drainage ditch along Highway 35. She was obviously no longer of this world, and was only wearing orange socks. This woman was identified to be in her 20s, and had red hair, hazel eyes, and weighed about between 140 and 160 pounds. An odd detail to be uncertain about, but I digress. Markings on her body suggest that she'd been drug across the guardrail next to Highway 35, and she was presumed to be transient, as she had some untreated diseases, long, unkempt fingernails, and a generally unhygienic appearance. Ultimately, the reason she passed away was from strangulation. They suspected she'd been hitchhiking due to reports of a similar-looking individual walking along Highway 35 with her thumb out the previous night. Oddly, these reports came from the same individual, an anonymous woman who actually phoned the police with information about the woman that was found in the ditch 3 separate times. Admittedly, following the calls from the woman though, the case went cold, and nobody was able to identify her, and she became known for decades by the only article of clothing she was wearing, her orange socks. Now, the orange socks case did have one promising lead. A serial killer named Henry Lee Lucas, who confessed to the crime. He claimed that he picked her up in Oklahoma City before dumping her in Georgetown, a detail that was well aligned with a matchbook and a key card from Oklahoma City that Orange Socks was carrying. And this was at first taken seriously, with Henry receiving a death sentence for the crime. But this punishment was put on hold as evidence came out that at the time of Orange Sock's attack, Lucas was likely in Florida. Strong evidence that he was just claiming responsibility for this for the attention. Additionally, almost exactly 1 year later, on November 1st of 1980, a similar scene presented itself as a woman was found to have been strangled along Interstate 45 in Walker County, Texas. And while never confirmed, many believe that these crimes may have been perpetrated by the same individual. Finally, in August of 2019, nearly 4 decades after Orange Socks was found, the DNA Doe project came forward announcing they'd likely identified a cousin of Orange Socks. Later inquiry confirmed that she was a member of a family named the Jacksons, of whom they directly compared DNA and finally concluded who Orange Socks was. Her name in life was Deborah Jackson, and she'd run away from home in 1978. She'd done this before, and her family just presumed that she'd finally left for good, which frankly was the correct assumption. Deborah, for the time after she left home, had been working at the Ramada Inn in Amarillo, Texas, and an assisted living facility in Azle, Texas, both in 1978. While it's certainly a tragedy that Deborah passed away, especially in the manner she did, there's at least some solace, I suppose, knowing that she can now rest as a named individual and that her family at least knows what happened to her. On Halloween of 1957, it was 11 p.m., and LA hairstylist Peter Fabiana was getting ready for bed alongside his wife Betty. He was settled in, and suddenly the door rang. But undismayed, Peter went downstairs to grab the candy bowl and hand out one more piece of candy to the last trick-or-treater. When he opened the door to meet the individual, he was greeted not with trick-or-treat, but with a voice Betty described as deep and a loud popping noise that startled Betty and woke up her daughter. Betty ran down the stairs only to find Peter bleeding profusely, and then she ran next door to her neighbor's home, who was a police officer, to get help. Peter was picked up by an ambulance and taken to Sun Valley Hospital, where he was pronounced dead from being shot. There was only one witness to the event, a teenager, who, while concluding his Halloween festivities, identified a car speeding away from the neighborhood. At the crime scene, no shells were left behind, and the event was clearly not a robbery, because despite the family being relatively wealthy, nothing was stolen from the home. At first, the police speculated that this may have been a gang hit, but they weren't sure about this as Peter had no criminal history or connections to any gang from what they could tell. Betty's account of the night was that she actually thought there were two individuals, a woman and a man who was pretending to be a woman. When asked if Peter had any enemies, though, Betty did have one solid answer, a woman named Joanne Rabel. Joanne was a Philadelphia-born woman who was a writer and photographer, and her travels had recently taken her to Los Angeles. To be blunt about it, Joanne and Betty had actually recently had an affair together, which sparked from their friendship when Betty and Peter had been fighting a lot. This caused Joanne and Betty to move in together for a brief time even. Betty, however, decided that she didn't want to give up on her marriage with Peter, nor her child, and she returned to Peter, admitting her affair and reconciling, agreeing to no longer see Joanne. I can only presume that if this was the whole story, Joanne probably would have gone on with her life. But it seems that the fires of hatred once again ignited in her when, by chance, she began to fall for yet another woman. She started spending time with a woman named Goldine Pizer, who at one point mentioned how she had an evil boss who was controlling and manipulative. And this boss, of course, happened to be Peter. This led Joanne down a path to try to convince Goldine to off Peter for her, and she did just that. Goldine bought a weapon under the guise of using it for self-defense, and she walked to the Fabiano residence, having been driven in a borrowed car by Joanne. She then knocked on the door, and in a superhero eye mask, she blasted Peter to smithereens right in his doorstep. As Betty listed off Joanne as an enemy of Peter in interviews, the breadcrumbs here were sort of obvious, and they led detectives directly to the door of Goldine. Joanne, too, was eventually arrested. The two were sentenced to 5 years to life in prison, and Goldine was actually released relatively shortly, staying in LA and passing away at 83. I couldn't actually find out what happened to Joanne, but it's also thought she was released around the same time as Goldine. Throughout this ordeal, Betty was presumed innocent. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Halloween is one of my favorite holidays, and while the supernatural aspects often get the spotlight, the real historical horrors that have occurred on this day are just as captivating. Quick note, if you do have any tips regarding the ongoing missing persons cases I covered, please consider contacting the FBI directly. Your information could really make a difference. On screen right now, you'll see some names listed. These are my channel members, and I can't thank them enough. Your support means the world to me. Additionally, if you enjoyed this video, I humbly invite you to like it and subscribe to my channel. And also, if I missed anything or made an error, I always appreciate your comments and corrections. With that said, whether you find a shoe slightly sticking out of the ground or come across a missing persons flyer with a potential tip, don't you ever forget, it's always story time.